So the agenda is, number one, why the hell are you guys here? I'm imagining most of you guys are founders, but let me know by a raise of hands, are you guys a founder? Okay. And how many of you guys are wanting to be a founder or wanting to start a business that haven't gotten started yet? Okay, cool. And then out of those founders, how many of you guys are have customers? Okay. And that's a good chunk of you. And how many of you guys are profitable? All right, fair enough. Good deal. So we're going to cover that. We're going to cover grit. I think founder DNA, I think is really important because I can share all the tools in the world. At the end of the day, if you don't have the mentality or the mindset, it's really kind of useless, right? So I think just kind of sharing some of those things, sharing some of the statistics. I think, again, in the post I sent last night, I think it's important to really face reality and understand what's in front of us in terms of go-to-market and how we're going to try to differentiate ourselves in what has historically been a very frothy, saturated market. And so I'm going to share some of those ideas. I'll give you a little bit more about my background if that's going to be contextual. But the idea here is that through Mucker and through being a founder myself, I've been exposed to working with 400 plus startups and that have been venture backed. And I don't think I'm smart by any means. I think what I've been able to do has been put into a position where I'm able to work with so many founders and startups that I can crowdsource growth experiments at scale. And I know from a solo, as a founder myself, at any given time, I can probably max out at 10 growth experiments at a given time. So when I'm working with 10 to 15 startups in advisory capacity, now I can do 100, 150 experiments, and I can then figure out which ones are working for specific portfolio companies and then share that wealth of knowledge back to the community at large. And that's really what I'm doing here. None of this stuff is original ideas from me necessarily. It's been proven out. It's stuff that I've seen actually work with specific portfolio companies, and I'll actually walk through real exercises, so that'll be helpful. The other part to think about is this 3% rule. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard about this, but obviously we're all familiar with TAM and total available market. But in reality, only 3% of your market is in a buying pattern or behavior at any given time. So if you guys are constantly sending out what you are doing and why you're so great and ROI driven language, there's a 97% chance it's falling on deaf ears, right? So what are you doing with that 97%? Because you're not negating it, it's actually part of your market. But they're not in a buying pattern, right? And so how do you nurture those until ultimately they become in a buying pattern or educate them in a process? I'm also gonna share what I've seen that doesn't work anymore, as I kind of alluded to, and then also the top 10 growth hacks that I've kind of discovered in, again, sourcing from different resources and experts. So I shared with you kind of already why what I'm sharing in terms of my wealth of knowledge and how I got it. We already kind of went through this of why are you guys here? And this is a short video just from an Alex Hormozy video of 3 traits of a successful entrepreneur. I think it's kind of interesting. I'm just going to have him share what those things are. I do feel like this resonates, especially the second one, which talks about every successful entrepreneur typically has a deep-rooted insecurity.
The 3 most common traits of hyper-successful people. The influencer world wants to be you have to wake up at 5, or you have to do cold plunges, or whatever right? There was actually very few that they all had in common. So number 1 was that they had a superiority complex. They thought they were better than other people and that they deserved more. The second is that they suffered from massive insecurity and feeling that they would never be enough. And third, they had impulse control. And so you've got this combination of people who are I want to do this big thing. So this big toward thing. And they've got this big away pain that's I'm never going to be enough. I always have to do more. And then they have impulse control that keeps them focused on the goal without seeing the woman in the red dress or getting pursued by her. And that, so it's shoot high, have a big thing that motivates, have a big tiger behind you and stay on the path.
Cool. And so that leads me to this topic, which is what is grit? Because again, if you guys don't have this grit, it's really going to be hard to, I think, become a successful entrepreneur or a successful founder. These are a few examples from interviews that I've done through either a podcast or webinar or through our founders roundtable events, just talking to founders of things that they've had to go through. So this first one, choosing to charge your laptop versus turning on the heat. This is coming from a guy named Christian Lang, who has $1 billion business that he called TradeShift that he recently exited from. And he's from the Nordic region, where you're talking about freezing temperatures that are way below zero. And when they were first starting off, they were working out of a garage, and they had to decide when they're going to charge their laptops versus turning on the heat. Taking a second mortgage out on your house. This is something that Danny Hay from a company called Soapbox that just raised a Series A had to decide with his partner to get their business off the ground. So before they raised any capital, they took out a second mortgage to proof of concept of their business for 2 years before they actually raised anything. Eating ramen for 2 years, I mean, I could say at least a handful of founders I know have done some version of that. Another version is like living with 10 people in a 500 square foot apartment. I've seen others that take on a second job to fund their primary one. So that could be in the form of literally driving an Uber around, or it could be in the form of like taking on consultative work in order for them to fund their business. Because the reality is in the very beginning, you're going through a lot of things to prove out that your idea actually is merited, right? Nobody's gonna give you money if you're not willing to put in your own resources, whether that's financial, blood, sweat, and tears, into making it work and proving it out. And this last one I think is very real, is like sometimes you have to give up your circle of friends or sometimes even family to pursue what you're trying to pursue, because they're not gonna always understand the crazy ideology of what you're doing, right? I was just talking to one of the JP Morgan people. It was like, you know, if I was to explain to my parents that, hey, I might go to jail for me to start this startup, you know, they're probably going to look at me like I'm crazy. But that's a very real narrative for people like Brian Chesky of Airbnb and Travis Kalanick from Uber, where these are truly disruptive technologies. And if you're doing something along those lines, those are real conversations. Like, and that's a very practical situation for a startup founder to have to go through. And so what are you going to do when you're facing those things? Again, not to be a downer, but I think it's, again, important to talk about these things so we have a very realistic picture. These are some stats, right? So 90% of startups will fail. Less than 0.05% get VC funding. 72% of founders struggle with mental health. 81% of founders hide their stress, fears, and challenges from others. More than half hide their stress from even their co-founders. Last year, 770 startups shut down, which is a pretty drastic increase from 2022 of 467. First 2 months of this year of 2024, 61 startups shut down, which is higher than fourth quarter of last year. And I think this is important because the reality is starting a startup is like a marathon disguised as a sprint, right? And so when you look at a race, there's only like, you're not running a race to be in the middle of the pack, right? And you're not starting a business to end up in the middle of the pack. If you're going in with that mindset, you're probably never gonna get anywhere anyways. You're trying to place first, second, third, whatever it might be. To me, the things that I've seen like successful founders actually get to being placed at first, second, or third is the ability to outlast, right? Having the endurance to deal with more shit and more uncomfortable situations than the rest of the crowd. And the longer you can last, success could potentially be around the corner. I think of a quote from like Denzel Washington, who says, you know, success is falling down 7 times, getting up 8. You know, I think like that's very much holds true to entrepreneurship and founders. I also think that through community, through talking to founders and having you guys talk to one another, sharing stories, can maybe help push you guys to a place where you're gonna fall down 10, get up 11. Because that 11th time you get up might just be the time that shit turns around and you see that hockey stick type of growth. And I think that's really important to think about. One more clip I'll just share, and this is the last clip, but this is Jensen Huang. Obviously, NVIDIA is now the #2 largest company in the world that just surpassed Apple.
If you were magically 30 years old again today in 2023, and you were going to Denny's with your 2 best friends who are the 2 smartest people you know, and you're talking about starting a company, what are you talking about starting?
I wouldn't do it. I know. The reason why I wouldn't do it, and it goes back to why it's so hard, is building a company and building a video turned out to have been 1,000,000 times harder than any of us expected it to be. And at that time, if we realized the pain and suffering and just how vulnerable you're gonna feel and the challenges that you're gonna endure, the embarrassment and the shame and the list of all the things that go wrong, I don't think anybody would start a company. Nobody in their right mind would do it. And I think that's the superpower of an entrepreneur. they don't know how hard it is. And they only ask themselves, how hard can it be? And to this day, I trick my brain into thinking, how hard can it be? I'm still enjoying myself immensely, and I'm adding a little bit of value, but that's really the trick of an entrepreneur. You have to get yourself to believe that it's not that hard, because it's way harder than you think. And if I go taking all of my knowledge now and I go back and I said, I'm going to endure that whole journey again, I think it's too much. It is just too much.
Do you have any suggestions on any kind of support system or a way to get through the emotional trauma that comes with building something like this?
Family and friends and all the colleagues we have here. I'm surrounded by these people that never one time gave up, and they never one time gave up on me. And that's the entire ball of wax. And to be able to go home and to have your family be fully committed to everything that you're trying to do, and thick or thin, they're proud of you and proud of the company. And you need that. You need the unwavering support of people around you. Jim Gaithers and the Tench Coxes and Mark Stevens and Harvey Jones and all the early people of our company, the Bill Millers. They not one time gave up on the company and us, and you need that. And I'm pretty sure that almost every successful company and entrepreneurs that have gone through some difficult challenges, they had that support system around them.
Cool. Last clip. So still, you guys want to be a founder, right? Awesome. All right, let's go. So what doesn't work anymore in the go-to-market motions? The traditional like B2B space, doing the SDR, BDR, AE, customer success model, having them operate in independent silos, that doesn't work anymore. Drip campaigns don't work anymore, meaning that you just enroll a bunch of people into a cold outreach and then have that go off for 20 times in the course of like the next 3 months. That doesn't work. ROI driven language, I already kind of like mentioned around that. If only 3% of your market's actively buying, why are you just talking about ROI? Email and LinkedIn as standalone channels, which has been the basis for a lot of enterprise sales the past 10 years, as standalone, again, doesn't work by itself. So when I think about go-to-market, when I think about sales, like you're really trying to optimize for 3 variables. And this is from one of the previous playbooks, but you're optimizing for your audience, your channels, and your messaging. Audience meaning your ideal customer profile, which is like an account that is going to make a good customer for you by company, is kind of how I define it. And then the personas within those companies. So those are going to be the individuals that's involved in a buying decision. You better break all those things down. And I shared that in the links before. It's all there. Channels, this is talking about not just email, LinkedIn, but we're talking about like if you have a direct phone number of somebody, that gives you 3 channels. That gives you SMS, ringless voicemail, and cold calling. A physical mailing address gives you an access to, direct mail and foot traffic, right? And so I don't think a lot of people think of it in that context. When you think about the consumer journey, you would never buy like a no-name consumer brand if somebody just shot emails to you all day long or LinkedIn DMs, right? Like the way that we consume something as a consumer good would be like we see a billboard and we're driving by it, or we see some streaming ad on our favorite show and then an Instagram ad, and then we maybe get a discount code because they did a good job of retargeting to us. Then we're most likely to buy. And the B2B situation has to mirror that, right? So we have to hit them up through LinkedIn. We have to hit them up through Google search and SEM. And then we have to hit them up through email still, but we also have to try things like cold calling, direct mail. A lot of things combined together as part of an overall sequence to then generate that awareness, trust, and then ultimately a conversion. Messaging too, I think of it in this context is like, I don't think you have to completely veer away from ROI or like what value you're bringing, but social proof incorporated in your messaging, focusing on messaging that's actually going to elicit engagement or an interaction. So what are different things that you can pull on, and I'll share some of those things, that's going to get people to talk to you. That's what you're trying to do, right? You're trying to get to that next step of getting just somebody to respond. It's to forget about selling, get them to respond to you, and then from response, how do you elicit a positive response, right? And from a positive response, how do you get that into a meeting? Because a lot of people try to think of it in this way, which is like, I'm going to reach out and I'm going to try to convert to customer. And that it doesn't work that way, at least not anymore. Here's some of the things that I've noticed and shift. So attention is a commodity. There's a value associated to it. All of your guys' attention is worth something. I have to provide value up here, otherwise you're just going to leave, right? And it's the same thing as when somebody tries to get your marketing attention. Somebody's trying to sell you a product or a software or some kind of service, right? It's got to feed into something that you inherently need, or it fits a value that you feel like is worthwhile for you to give it attention, right? And I think not a lot of people think about this when they're selling, but that is very much what you have to think of from that mindset. And so whatever you're offering, whatever you're trying to get from that engagement perspective, has to meet or exceed their value of that time. Again, some of these other channels that I've seen work really well, especially like in the SME space or SMB, which is like mid-level enterprise or small, medium-sized businesses, is SMS and ringless voicemail. For a long time, I mean, when I bring this up to portfolio companies, like they're like, what's that? And I'll talk about some of those examples. Again, I mentioned the SDR AE CS is broken. Team selling is a must. Everybody that's mentioned in those groups, whether from sales, marketing, customer success, they all have to work together in trying to acquire a customer. Because what's happened traditionally that I've seen is like SDR, like the sales team, the SDRs and the AEs will bring on a customer, they're not talking to customer success, and then you see churn, and that becomes a big problem, right? It doesn't matter if you're able to close a deal, if you have a hard time implementing or onboarding them because it takes them 6 months and they never use your product, then this might as well just be a loss, right? You just wasted everybody's time. So that becomes much more of a requirement. In a lot of these interviews that I've been doing through our webinars, talking to sales leaders, I hear this idea of becoming problem solvers in an altruistic way. And what I mean by that is you're going to come in and you're going to try to solve that potential prospect's problems and what they're dealing with on a day in and day out basis by creating some kind of value for them that may or may not actually pertain to what it is that you guys are solving for, because that helps build trust. Relationship mapping. I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this in the sales process, which is like, okay, we need to do a follow-up call. And a lot of salespeople, what they'll do is they'll use this as a discovery process to figure out who needs to be on the call. And put all this responsibility on the buyer to organize it. And then the deal goes dead or it goes cold, right? Relationship mapping is doing your research. A lot of times you can go and look at your existing customer profiles and like literally look at the thread from day one outreach to when they converted and look at it over a timeline. And if you have like 10 customers, 20, 30 customers, the more the merrier, the better data you have, you're going to see categorically what type of touch points are actually required versus which ones are superfluous. So it's going to help you shorten your sales cycle and be more optimal with how you actually structure the time that you're doing to close a deal. And then also you're going to see who was involved in the decision-making process. So what I would do is go in to a conversation and be like, oh, great, Tom. So by the end of the conversation, they're going to say, well, I need to bring the team on. And then if I can go in and say, well, does Mary, Chris, and Steven also need to be on the call because of their job titles? Great, let's just verify that and let me take on the take on my shoulders the lift of going ahead and coordinating that by reaching out to them directly. And so by doing that, I take on the onus of moving the deal along versus putting that on the buyer. Okay, it's so basic, but like I don't know why more companies don't do that. It's just a little bit of extra research and time. The other thing is commodity sellers will win. So what is a commodity seller? This is like somebody that's selling like The Office, like selling paper, right? Like selling paper is a commodity. And so what commodity selling is, this is more like old school selling, but I see a lot of this trend coming back because markets are becoming more saturated. It's very difficult to differentiate yourself from competitors, perhaps. People are going to be buying from the salesperson, right? So the way that you position yourself and how you sell is what's going to convince them as to whether or not they become a customer of your companies. ABM marketing, this goes back to like the SDR, AECS coming together and working together, is account-based marketing. So you working as a team to bring all the decision makers from the prospect side to then to sell the company in whole. One of the things I try to remind people also of is like, you might be selling your solution and it might be the greatest thing in the world, but I guarantee you even on the most maximum situation, like it's probably only 10% of your buyer's day-to-day problem, right? So you have to be compassionate and empathize to that. If you're just trying to constantly sell them, like, you're not realizing that they've got like a bunch of other things on their plate. If you did and you actually took the initiative to learn a little bit more about that, maybe you could speak to that as a means to elicit a timeline for when to follow up with them that's going to be more optimal for you to move things forward. Again, making it easier for buyers to buy. This is an exercise that I've seen a lot of sales leaders come back to, especially those that are like advising larger enterprise companies, is like, what can we do? And a lot of them, they'll come in, this like first audit of a company is to understand like, what can we do to make it easier for the buyer experience? The implementation and onboarding is something I see a lot with portfolio companies, where that is like the biggest bottleneck for converting into a customer. Because it's taking too long, or it's too much of a lift, or you're asking the customer to open up data sets that's gonna like require a month. You need to make it much more easier. The other two words that I hear a lot for go-to-market and sales is community and content. And I'm going to dive into that, what that means and what that looks like. Talking to customers and targeting your ICP quarterly. I don't see enough founders that do this, which is like literally interview your customers every quarter. Don't be afraid of what they're going to say. Embrace what they're going to say, even if it's problematic, because that's going to help you solve something that's going to at least get ahead of it way before it becomes a bigger issue. That's what I see a lot of times about scalability. Like, we're talking about 0 to 1 right now, perhaps, but like I see companies that are more later stage, like Series B or later, this is when they start stagnating, is that they stop talking to customers, or they stop really understanding that pain point, because their product's probably evolved, their base has probably evolved, and so they need to evolve their messaging. They have to evolve what it is in terms of like how they speak to them. And the last point here is that I think is like super relevant, is you got to get out of your own way, and founders are going to have to become influencers now on LinkedIn. And you see that a lot. Like, if you guys have probably noticed, you see a bombardment of like founders that are sharing a bunch of content. Now, they're not, it may look like they're doing it themselves, but they're not doing it themselves. This is, again, taking from more of like the, CPG kind of model, like how to leverage influencers. But again, people are buying from people, right? And it's becoming harder to differentiate your product. So how else can you differentiate? And so founders, I've seen some companies where that's become their primary channel for driving pipeline. Talked about this 3% rule. I don't know, this is again from the previous playbooks. I don't know enough companies that do the TAM, SAM, SOM analysis. How many of you guys are aware of TAM, SAM, SOM? Raise your hand. All right, how many of you guys actually like implement it or execute it as part of your go-to-market? Okay, fair enough. So still like a wide range of you guys, because I saw a lot more hands that said you guys are founders. So, and very few that do this. But why is TAM, SAM, SOM important? And I think from a product perspective, it's really important, because your product is not going to be perfect on day one. So whatever you're launching with most likely won't service your entire TAM on day one, right? So the goal is to like figure out who does your product actually service for. And to me, that's their serviceable, obtainable market today. And so by understanding and getting very granular around that, you know who to talk to, you know how to talk to them, because it's going to be different than when you evolve your product later and talk to that TAM. I look at TAM as like where your product will be 3+ years, and your SAM is where your product will be in like the next 1 to 2 years. So you should plan accordingly. And this is like an ongoing thing. So like as time progresses, you're constantly changing your TAM, SAM, SOM. All right, so I'm going to dive into just some of these hacks I've seen. Number one, there's a lot of AI tools out there, right? I went to this Clay.com this event yesterday, and they had a panel, and they're all like Clay experts, and they were doing a great job of talking about response rates escalating to 5x, 6x, and all that stuff, right? I think sometimes like with AI, it can be dangerous, and it makes it easy for everybody to start creating personalized messaging and stuff like that. And I think like, if I was to ask you guys, how many times have you guys bought something from a cold email? By show of hands? All right, okay. So if I give you the most awesomest tool in the world, but nobody's still buying, and that's why I thought it was funny, because they talked about response rate, that's one thing, but is it actually driving an outcome? Is it actually leading to customer conversion or revenue? That's an entirely different story, right? And it goes back to what I was alluding to before, is like, you want to get responses, great, but then what are you doing with that? Is it positive responses, or is it people just saying F you and go away? Because if you can get responses, one part of the problem, turning into positive to then creating into that like deeper form of engagement. That's what we're trying to figure out. What I would say that Clay does a good job of is actually aggregating data. So like building out a database, which for B2B space, your database is probably your biggest asset. And I spoke about that before in the previous playbooks. If you have 100 target accounts in your TAM, like in most situations, it's only going to fluctuate in any given year plus or minus a few percentage points, right? It's not going to be like another 100 accounts that just came up, not likely. And so in that instance, you want to get all 100 contacts, right? Like you want to be able to remarket to them, and you ultimately the goal will be is get to binary answers like yes, they are interested in your solution, or no, they are not, and you want to get to that as quickly as possible. And the only way you do that is be able to have all that contact so you can go back, remarket to them, try to figure out how to remessage to them in the future, so that over time you're able to get to that binary answer. A few other tools though that I do mention that also help, I think, for building out your databases is Phantom Buster. It's been like one that's a little bit more technical, but I found that very useful. It's built, it's a bunch of like APIs that developers create, and they monetize off as like a developer marketplace, but they help you literally scrape LinkedIn, Slack, different types of data sets across a lot more platforms. Bardeen is a Chrome extension that also allows you to scrape web pages, and I'll share why that's important. And there's another company called databar.ai, which is a Mucker portco, but they're also very similar to a clay.com. In my experience, they actually like help you scrape a lot more things to build out your database. And obviously you can always go back to like the Zoom Infos of the world and like the Apollos of the world. I will say like Apollo and Zoom Info is expensive, and they're good for enterprise, and it's pretty accurate for the enterprise. But if you go down market like SME and SMB, I find it to be not as accurate in terms of like its data versus some other resources. Number 2 is leveraging content creation for both top to mid funnel engagement. So this goes back to like the historic outreach of ROI campaigns, doing that over and over again. I think every founder should be hosting a podcast or a webinar because that gives you another point of outreach, another conversation piece to have. People love to talk about themselves, so why not appease to the ego, right? I found response rates or positive response rates be like 5 to 10x higher when I asked them to be a guest on a webinar or a podcast, right? And these are all potential customers. So whoever you have as a guest should obviously fall within your ICP, right? And for us, another pre-qualifier for that would be they have to have at least 50,000 followers on LinkedIn, right? Because we're trying to leverage and crowdsource that visibility for my business. But think about things in like that context, right? Like how do you gain maximum awareness? How do you squeeze the most juice out of whatever effort that you're doing? And that's what I mean by using content creation to drive sales pipeline. Is that so many people will create content and then use that as a way as a lure or a gated piece of content to then capture leads. What I'm talking about is using that as a means to create your sales pipeline and reaching out. And they don't know that you're reaching out for the purpose of them to become a customer, right? They just want to talk about themselves. But if you go ahead and you start that form of engagement, and you know because you've done your research that that person or that company is on paper a good fit for your solution, use that as a way to build trust, use that as a way to build a relationship, and then sell them in like 2 to 3 weeks later, right? Before we launched our company, we started a podcast for that purpose. And I had done 30 episodes of that, and about 5 of those guests ended up becoming our first customers when we launched, right? I don't think a lot like this. It sounds so logical, but I think a lot of people don't spend the time on doing things like that. And then post content clips. Again, make it easier for people to get awareness. All of our webinars and podcasts, we give back to every single guest all the assets that they need to share it and tag us in it. We literally will give them the post, all of our URLs and social media handles, and we give it to them so all they have to do is copy and paste it. and we give them all at least 3 to 5 short form clips that are 30 to 60 seconds long. There's tools out there that help you automate it, like Opus clips. There's a ton of them out there now that will help you automate that, take long form content and change it to short. But do that so that it can help generate awareness, right? All of our little videos are tagged with our logo, and so the more exposure and more sharing that happens, all of a sudden within certain communities, they're gonna start wondering, what the hell is this? Number 3 is building community to create a content flywheel. So I believe every company should have a Slack channel for their customers and their target ICP. Within those communities, you get insights around what their day-to-day challenges are, right? So now you know what kind of content is gonna get their attention, right? I don't know why people just write stuff arbitrarily and think it's gonna get people to respond, right? I think you really need to engage with them. It's so easy to just ask, and people are willing to give you answers if you take that initiative. I think that goes back to maybe some of that psychological fear of like just engaging with people, but you got to get into that routine of talking and having conversations over and over again with them. Once you know what those day-to-day challenges are, create the content that's going to help alleviate some of that. Bring in experts, bring in other people that, it doesn't have to be you speaking on it, could just be you interviewing somebody else that actually knows the answers, right? I think do that. You'll have, again, like that cycle of things of people are willing to share information, especially like at the leadership level. So many people are willing to share, what they've learned because that's how they got to where they got to. And I think you'll find that people are pretty accessible if you approach them in a very compassionate and empathetic way. And then obviously you want to find ways to connect your product as a solution at some point of that cycle, right? Cool. So the other thing here is, like as I mentioned, is building a database. I find, especially if you guys are selling it to SMB or SME, this may or may not be relevant to you. If you're selling it to enterprise, it may not be, but there's so many more resources for enterprise. So I think this is important. I'm going to actually show you what this looks like. So if your target ICP has to be licensed professionally for some reason, whether that's a cosmetologist or a psychologist or somebody in the medical profession or a contractor or short-term property rental owners, or in this case, freight forwarding companies. If you have to be licensed, there's a good chance that there's public databases either in the form of the county, the city, state, or federal. So I'm just going to do a freight forwarder license lookup. I'm going to go to here. And wow, I have all this data. It's like ready at my disposal. They actually make it really easy for me here to just download the entire list. And why is this relevant? Is because these phone numbers and the people who are usually registering their companies with that license are going to be probably decision makers, right? They're probably going to be the owners of the company, and the numbers that they're providing probably is not going to be a general line. It's going to be a direct line to them. So like I went back to before, SMS, ringless voicemail, things like that, cold calling, those now become really relevant channels, and you have actually direct lines. I did a test with pulling from these types of databases versus what ZoomInfo is able to provide, and this is much more accurate, much more reliable in terms of like creating output. Cool. So going back to this. I'll share this too with you guys. You guys don't have to keep taking pictures, but you guys will get it afterwards. Number 5 is using SMS, so using text message for driving pipelines. I'll share a quick example, but again, like now you have contact data. What do you do with that contact data? Are you going to just try to be like, hey, we're solving this problem, and we'd like to carve out a time with you? Maybe that'll work. It depends on who you're trying to sell into, right? It also depends how strong your product market fit is. If it's like an ongoing problem for people, like for example, you have a list of people that have a broken leg and you're selling crutches, right? Like obviously that's a different situation. You can just be like, we're selling crutches and it's going to be an immediate pain they're going to need a solution for. But if it's not a situation like that, and again, it's more of like a commodity space where you're just trying to capture attention, I found incentives are a good way to do it. So maybe offer $50 for 15 minutes of time, and then work up your way from there. Figure out what your customer acquisition cost and how much you can spend to actually elicit engagement, right? I think that's really important, and work backwards from certain numbers to figure out how much can you spend to acquire the different stages? So how much can I spend to acquire a response? How much can I spend to acquire a positive response? How much can I spend to acquire a demo or a meeting, right? Those, which we now know typically is a sales qualified lead, versus then how much can I spend on a customer? Yeah, fuck it, I can share you. And I'm just going to use like real examples, right? So text message solution that I use is called Text Magic. Literally say, can you share 15 minutes for $50 to give us feedback on a freight forwarding software company? Sure. Send them a meeting link. They didn't book it because they don't believe it, so they said, call my cell. Call the cell, booked it over the phone, okay? And I have a few others like this. This is again from that database. So you can see the thread here. This one's who's this? So I send them some information. And they actually said, hey, we're actually up for renewal with our current provider soon. That we have been with for close to 20 years. So sure, why not? Shit, right? I mean, like, this is like untapped stuff. Booked a time, got it, got the provider of who they're using. Very easily now, able to provide client with like a bunch of great intelligence. So anyways, I think that's important just to kind of show you in real practicality. All right. Ringless voicemail versus cold calling. Okay, so again, you have a phone number. This is now even true for if you're trying to sell into startups. Crunchbase has a wealth of data in there, and usually every startup, probably you guys all who have startups probably registered on Crunchbase at some point in time. And depending on what stage, that might have been very recent or it might have been a while ago. And if it was a while ago, most likely you probably put in a phone number that's your phone number because that's what you do. So there's a lot of like data in Crunchbase that is actually going to give you the contact of a founder. And they might now be at a Series C, Series D, Series later, and you have some form of contact to get in front of them. So I think about cold calling, and the thing that I try to look at when I work with companies is what is your connect rate, right? You're having SDRs make 100 phone calls a day. Great. How many of them are actually talking to somebody, let alone talking to the decision maker, right? And the chances are 10% is a generous connect rate. So like out of every 100 calls, they're connecting with 10 people, right? Most of the times, again, it's not going to be a decision maker. What ringless voicemail does is I see an average of about 20% callback rate. So if you drop 100 ringless voicemails, you can do that. You could do 1,000. But it depends on what callback rate is. Out of every 100 ringless voicemails I drop, I get 20 to call back. And now, all of a sudden, I have people's attention. It depends on what I say. Certain markets, I've seen them be able to drive meetings, especially founder-led sales teams, where they like, and I would say like a vertical SaaS company, a company that was like selling a software that fixes commercial kitchen equipment. It's a family business. They've been doing it for like 20, 30 years. And so he was great at converting callbacks into demos. Then in the other example, like this freight forwarding company, not great at converting into meetings. Why? Because this persona type has actually been burned in the past. Like a lot of these like steeper tech learning curve industries, like I think of freight forwarding or logistics companies, things like that. There was like this huge burst of like vertical SaaS companies coming to solve their problems, and they may or may not have been providing the best solution out there. And so you have these people that aren't tech savvy people that, buy legacy software, meaning they only buy once every 10, 20 years, as like that one mentioned. And so when they took these meetings with people that were just like bombarding them because nobody before was really hitting them up about like new solutions, now they got bombarded. Now their attention went to listening to about software pitches, and then they bought something that may or may not 50-50 like reliable or not reliable. So they're not really going to be open to talking about it. And so I know when we tested this, we try to drive into meetings, but the moment we mention software, hang up the phone. So instead, what might be better is then enriching lead data, right? Getting an email address, validating that they're a decision maker, things like that. And that's actually scalable, because instead of you running that internally with your SDR, BDRs, where you're paying $20, $30 an hour, you can outsource this to a virtual assistant for like $5 an hour, right? And so for every 100 calls, if you were able to like then turn 20 of those into enriched data leads, and you're paying like $5 an hour to do that, I mean, you're paying less than $1 to enrich a lead that ultimately you can go back to over time to, again, convert. That to me is like much more valuable for that time. This one we already kind of talked about, but relationship mapping, right? So I think, like, again, going into a conversation or a demo and being able to like know who the other stakeholders are before you actually get onto that call, and then just verify with them and take the responsibility of connecting with everybody and moving that deal along. So using surveys to build pipeline. So if you saw from the playbooks, right, you got to spend time to really understand where your target audience lives, sleeps, eats, and breathes, either online or in person. And some of those examples would be like, if you're trying to target contractors, maybe have somebody stand outside of a Home Depot Monday through Friday during like the hours that they're going to be, you know, buying supplies, right? Because there's always a digital version of that. Similarly, if you're selling some kind of like CPG good to stay-at-home moms with kids, you know, that are adolescents, you might have somebody stand outside of a yoga studio in a certain zip code between the hours of 11 to 2 p.m., right? Those are all ways that you can start building sales pipeline, maybe not in a scalable way, but there's always going to be a version of that later. I've used surveys as a way to qualify people in different groups and forums. We ran this exercise during the pandemic for a pediatric vision screening device. And so they came to me and they're like, you know what, we are not getting their attention at all because all of a sudden we're going through the pandemic and they don't have time to deal with stuff. So what we did was we spent time in the Facebook groups, because pediatricians like to talk to one another, get advice. They're sometimes sharing even images of different things that they don't know the answers to, like a rash on a kid. And so we spent like a month just like surveying all of that data, and we did a direct call out and outreach through emails and calls. And we said, look, we know you guys are super busy. And what we realized was that they are spending 150% more time for the same amount of pay, right? So if we can come in and be like, look, we can help you at least cut this portion out, so it's going to get you a little bit closer to a 1-for-1 for your time and pay, all of a sudden that opened up the door for these conversations, right? But unless you do that, you don't know it exists. So I think you need to go through that exercise. And we also use that as a way to, in order for us to get that intelligence, we ran those surveys in those groups to get that understanding. Number 9 here is, talked about this, like scalable founder-led influencer marketing. I have a few examples of, so this, Adam Robinson's the CEO of retention.com. He's got 83,000 followers, right? And you can see from some of his posts, they have great engagement, 124 engagement, 241, etc. So he's not running this by himself. I know the guy that is running it for him. But I think this just proves a point. And there's another guy called Sam Jacobs. He's the CEO of a sales community called Pavilion, which some of you guys are probably familiar with. Pretty large community now of like 20-some thousand sales and marketing go-to-market people. But he also is using the same person as Adam Robinson. And that person's name is Alec Paul. Alec Paul is the son of a guy that I had on my podcast, and his dad is the host of the Win Rate podcast, which is a sales podcast, and he helped his dad increase his visibility on LinkedIn, took that playbook, and then started doing it for other people. There's also a company called Rhetoric, which is a YC company, and they offer a very similar service, which is they will sit down with you, they literally interview the CEO or the founder once every week or once every 2 weeks, get what's top of mind for you, and then they figure out a way to turn that into content. Again, I think it's one of those things you can't run away from anymore. I had a founder that asked me the other day, is like, should I be creating content? It's like, yep, absolutely. And the last thing here is, again, the attention as a commodity, different ways to capture it. Talked about paying people for their time, This is a very common one now you see a lot of, but this is something we ran like 5 years ago, by asking people for feedback instead of asking for people to hop onto a demo, right? We also realized that when we send self-schedule links, there's a huge decrease in percentage of conversion versus when we asked for 3 possible dates and times instead. That's getting to the same outcome, right, of getting like something booked into a calendar. But when you put the onus or responsibility on the prospect, you have a lower chance of converting. Also, similarly, this isn't in here, but I think I speak about in a previous playbook is like turnaround time to getting responses. If it exceeds like 2-3 hours, your chances of getting somebody into a meeting goes from 80% down to 30-some%. So time of response is also really important. Giving them valuable content, appealing to the ego, asking them to be guests on podcasts and webinars, doing more altruistic selling or the commodity selling, and then talking to the customers regularly. All this funnels back to how you're going to be able to provide value for that attention. And on that note, I blasted through a lot of stuff in about 40 minutes, but I wanted to keep it open so we can answer some questions for the next like 10 minutes or so, and then feel free for you guys to network with one another as well. Cool? Yeah.
You talk about content a lot, involving all of your consumers, letting them, reaching them through different channels. Do you think it's going to get to a point where the consumers no longer trust the content because they're bombarded by too much? And if so, do you think there's going to be a change in the playbook down the road?
I think it depends on what content you're providing, right? Like, I think there's definitely stuff that, just put yourself in that situation, right? Like, what content are you actually consuming and why are you consuming it? I don't think we ask ourselves in the first person enough the why question when we're expecting somebody else to do it. You know what I mean? Like, would you do it? And it's like, if you can get to the root of like what's driving your why, then you're going to be able to figure out the same root of the other person's why. It may not be the same why, but the process of figuring it out, you're going to get theirs, right? So I think it's about that. I think for us, for example, like we just launched a founder community with 100 founders. And the goal for that is because all those 100 founders have companies that would make great customers for us, but we want to make sure we deliver value to them. And so already lined up next week, we have 2 webinars, one with the CTO of Johnson Controls, which is a Fortune 500 company, and then another one with a New York Times bestseller on sales, who's got like 700,000 followers on LinkedIn, and we're going to share that back to them, right? So like this is based on what they've asked for, and then we give it back to them, right? If you're just creating like out of your own hypotheses, then yeah, it's going to be more challenging.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you see for response rates to cold outreach via LinkedIn versus emailing the person's work email?
Again, it depends on what you're saying, right? I think like a rule of thumb is like a standard response rate from cold email is like 1% to 2% if you're lucky, if you're doing well. Really good ones are like 5-6%. I would say LinkedIn, again, similar, it depends on what you're saying. I think like what I've found is like personalization on LinkedIn works really well, right? So like I've had some people that tested videos and like personalizing videos and then sending it through LinkedIn DMs. That tends to work well for response rates. But it depends. If you're just sending a blanketed thing, you probably will get low response rates across all of them. So testing is always important, right? So always try different things. I think being really creative with what you're testing. Sometimes people like also get, I think, afraid of trying something that's a little bit outside the box. And I think like the more outside the box you should try it all, you'll be surprised as to what some of those ideas might actually do for you. Yeah.
I want to piggyback on that and ask, how do you balance between entertainment and education? Because we did a campaign recently, and in our experiment with YouTube, we found, in fact, the education ones had more hits than the entertainment ones.
I mean, so let that data dictate where your direction is, right? I think everything is just a blank canvas until you throw something onto it. And then to me, that's how we determine direction. Yeah, you have to look at numbers. Yeah.
Founder here. Thanks. Really rich content. Just real quick, want to understand how you think about managing a community. Just personally, I've joined so many communities, and some of them, have been valuable initially, but then it's just like a bunch of slacks.
Yeah.
Like records that I
Yeah.
really go back to. What's the best way to kind of foster it?
I think spend time, like, again, like look at the reasons why you interacted with communities, right? I think one thing, for example, that I just thought about this past week was we need to have a hiring section in our Slack community for our founders, right? Because that's one of the things I found very valuable, regardless of what community I've been a part of, is the hiring channel actually does a lot of engagement in there, right? Whether you're posting a resume for somebody else or you're posting a job, right? And we tend to trust these communities that we associate ourselves with as kind of like a first barrier or first means before we go to a wider, just blanketed like LinkedIn or Indeed or whatever, right? So I think about it in that context. Even like a recommendations channel, or like things that where people are sharing what they've seen actually work for them, you know? So I think that it goes back to that, again, thinking of empathizing with whoever you're trying to build community for and putting yourself there in the first person and then using that as maybe a route.
Have you tried, so yeah, one approach that we've been doing is like advisory boards, and they've been really helpful in terms of like with B2B.
Yeah.
Great. A lot of engagement there, but
Yeah.
it's like I'm driving a lot of that.
Yeah.
But still, have you tried to use the community as like a funnel in?
Yeah. And product advisory board is like one of those other asks that you can use, right? So I think about it like, again, if you have 100 accounts that are, I'm just using small numbers here, but 100 accounts that could be good for you, you know, maybe like I wouldn't reach out to all 100 today. I would break it up. So I might do like divided by 5. And so I'll do like 20 this week in cohort 1, 20 in week 2 for cohort 2, and all the way down until you get to week 6, which you're going to start rotating back to the original cohort. So the idea there is that you give them like a 5-week break from first cohort to the next outreach of whatever sequence you're doing, so that you know they get a breather from you, right? They're not just being bombarded. And in that time period, hopefully you have more social proof, whether you added a logo, had more content, creating some kind of value to give back to them that's new, that you learned or something that changed. And in doing so, I think of like, so I try to think about it this way. It's like, maybe when I first launch a campaign, I'll do some kind of like ROI education kind of thing, right? Just to give some context, expecting 0 conversion, right? But for the purpose of laying out a foundation. And then week 6, when I go back to cohort 1, I'll probably be like, hey, would you be interested in being a guest on a podcast, right? And then week 12, I might be like, hey, would you be interested in being on the product advisory board? And then week 18, I might go back with another ROI, which is like, hey, guess what? We just signed this XYZ customer, big logo, whatever, or maybe geographically is close to you and so they are familiar with it, whatever that might be. So that's how I interchange that, so that, again, trying to whittle down against all 100 over time, right?
That's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Anything else? Everybody else good? Cool. Give you guys the opportunity to network with one another. Thank you guys for coming out. Yeah. JP Morgan folks in the back and K&L people are around, so feel free to talk to them as well. And if you guys have any additional questions, let me know.